There is a place on this planet that humans have visited fewer times than the surface of the moon. Not because nobody wants to go, not because there is nothing there worth seeing, because the physics of getting there are more punishing than the physics of leaving the planet entirely. We have sent more people into orbit, more people to walk on lunar soil, more spacecraft past the edge of the solar system than we have sent to the deepest point in our own oceans. That fact alone should stop you. We chose space. We turned away from the deep, and what that turning away has left unexplored, sitting in permanent darkness, less than 11 kilometers beneath the surface of the water you can see from any beach, is larger and stranger than most people realize. If you enjoy drifting into the deep ocean and discovering what lies beneath, please consider liking and subscribing. It truly helps more than you know. Are you ready? Let's begin. There is a wall in the ocean that no amount of courage, money, or determination can get past, and it is not made of rock or current or darkness. It is made of pressure. The deepest point on Earth, the Challenger, deep in the Mariana Trench, sits at a depth where the water above exerts a force of approximately 1,071 atmospheres on anything trying to exist there. To put that number into a form the body can actually understand, it is the equivalent of having approximately 50 jumbo jets stacked on top of a single square meter of your skin, all at once, continuously, with no relief. The human body, unprotected, would not merely be injured by this pressure. It would be compressed past the point where its tissues retain their structure, its air spaces collapsing instantly, its fluids redistributing in ways that no medical intervention could reverse. This is not a hazard in the way that cold or darkness are hazards, conditions that can be survived with the right equipment and enough caution. Pressure at this depth is a hard physical limit, the kind that does not bend for ingenuity. And every vehicle that has ever attempted to reach the bottom of the ocean has been, in essence, an elaborate negotiation with a force that does not negotiate. The history of that negotiation begins in 1960 with a vehicle called the Trieste and two men, Jacques Piccard and Don Walsh, who became the first human beings to reach the Challenger Deep. The Trieste was not a submarine in the way that term is generally understood. It was a bathyscaphe, a design built around a thick steel sphere, suspended beneath a much larger float filled with gasoline, which is lighter than water, and was used because, unlike air, it does not compress significantly under the pressures the vehicle would encounter. The crew sphere itself had walls approximately 12 centimeters thick, forged from a single piece of steel, because a welded seam would have represented a point of weakness that the pressure at full depth would have found and exploited. The descent to the Challenger Deep took the Trieste approximately 4 hours and 48 minutes. Partway down, at a depth of approximately 9,000 meters, the crew heard a loud cracking sound that turned out to be a window in the entry tunnel above the pressure sphere fracturing under the strain. They continued the descent anyway, reaching the bottom, spending approximately 20 minutes there, long enough to observe what Piccard described as a flatfish resting on the sediment before the pressure-cracked window forced an early ascent. no human being would return to that depth for 52 years. The gap between 1960 and the next crewed descent to the Challenger Deep is itself a piece of evidence about how difficult this kind of exploration actually is. It was not that nobody wanted to go back. It was that the engineering required to build a vehicle capable of withstanding full ocean depth pressure reliably, with a margin of safety sufficient to bring a crew home, is extraordinarily difficult, extraordinarily expensive, and offers very little room for error. In 2012, the filmmaker James Cameron descended solo to the Challenger Deep in a vehicle called the Deep Sea Challenger, a different engineering approach built around a vertical torpedo-shaped hull designed to minimize the surface area exposed to pressure while maximizing internal volume for the pilot and equipment. The dive succeeded, and Cameron spent approximately 3 hours at the bottom before a hydraulic fluid leak forced an early ascent, but the vehicle itself was retired after the expedition. Its systems pushed to their design limits by a single mission. Reaching the deepest point on the planet is not a capability that, once achieved, becomes routine. Each successful descent has been closer to a singular engineering achievement than a repeatable operation, and the gap of more than 5 decades between the first and second crew dives to the Challenger Deep reflects exactly how singular those achievements have been. The material science behind deep diving vehicle design illustrates why this problem resists easy solutions even with modern engineering capabilities. A pressure hull for full ocean depth must be built from a material that can withstand enormous compressive force without fracturing, must maintain its structural integrity across the full range of operational temperatures from the warm surface to the near freezing water at depth, and must do all of this while being light enough that the vehicle retains usable buoyancy characteristics. Titanium alloys have become the material of choice for the most advanced deep submergence vehicles because they offer an exceptional strength-to-weight ratio and excellent resistance to the corrosive effects of seawater, but titanium pressure hulls are extraordinarily expensive to manufacture, requiring specialized welding techniques, extensive quality testing, and certification processes that can take years to complete for a single vehicle. The viewport windows, the transparent sections that allow occupants to actually see their surroundings, present an even more acute engineering challenge, because acrylic and other transparent materials behave differently under pressure than metal, and the failure mode of a viewport under extreme pressure is sudden and catastrophic rather than gradual. Every component of a full ocean depth vehicle exists in a design space where the margin between success and a catastrophic failure is measured in millimeters of material thickness and percentages of safety factor, and the testing required to validate that margin before risking a human crew is exhaustive, expensive, and time-consuming in ways that fundamentally limit how many vehicles can be built and how often they can be used. The limiting factor, a submersible developed by the explorer Victor Vescovo and piloted to the deepest point of all 5 of the world's oceans between 2018 and 2019, represents the most significant advance in crewed full ocean depth capability since the Trieste and the Deep Sea Challenger. Unlike its predecessors, which were essentially one-time engineering projects built for a single historic dive. The limiting factor was designed and certified for repeated dives to full ocean depth, a capability that had not previously existed. The vehicle completed dozens of dives to depths exceeding 10,000 meters, including multiple dives to the Challenger Deep itself, demonstrating that repeatable full ocean depth diving was achievable with sufficiently rigorous engineering and sufficiently deep financial investment. The cost of developing and certifying the limiting factor has not been fully disclosed publicly, but program costs for comparable deep submergence engineering efforts have run into the tens of millions of dollars, and the vehicle required years of design, testing, and certification work before it was cleared for crewed operation. The achievement of repeatable full ocean depth diving did not solve the fundamental problem of deep ocean exploration. It simply demonstrated that the problem could be addressed by a small number of extraordinarily well-funded, extraordinarily patient engineering programs, which is a very different thing from the ocean floor being routinely accessible. And it demonstrated something else, something that would be proven in the most brutal way possible less than 4 years later. That when the engineering is done right, when every margin is respected and every shortcut refused, the pressure can be held at bay. It is when those margins are not respected that the ocean reminds everyone exactly what it is capable of. The catastrophic loss of the Titan submersible in June of 2023, while attempting to reach the wreck of the Titanic at a depth of approximately 3,800 meters, a fraction of the depth of the Challenger Deep, provided a stark and very public demonstration of what happens when the margin of engineering safety that deep ocean exploration requires is not maintained. The Titan was built using a carbon fiber composite hull, a material choice that diverged from the titanium and steel construction that has dominated crewed deep submergence vehicle design for decades. And that choice was the subject of expressed concern from multiple individuals within the deep submergence engineering community in the years before the loss. Carbon fiber composites behave differently under repeated cycles of pressure than the metals traditionally used in pressure hull construction, with a greater susceptibility to a failure mode called delamination, in which the layers of the composite material separate from each other under repeated stress, a process that can occur gradually and without obvious external signs until the structural integrity of the hull has been critically compromised. The Titan had completed multiple previous dives before the dive that resulted in its loss and the implosion that destroyed the vehicle, and claimed all 5 people aboard occurred without any distress signal being received, consistent with a catastrophic structural failure that happened too quickly for any response. The investigation into the Titan's loss has examined the hull's construction, its testing and certification history, and the decision-making processes that led to its operation. And the findings have reinforced, in the most severe way possible, the lesson that deep ocean engineering does not tolerate shortcuts. The pressure does not care about innovation for its own sake. It only cares about whether the structure holds. The physics of why pressure increases the way it does underwater is straightforward in principle and brutal in its consequences at depth. Water is approximately 800 times denser than air, which means that the weight of water accumulates far more rapidly with depth than the weight of atmosphere accumulates with altitude. Pressure increases by approximately 1 atmosphere for every 10 meters of seawater depth, a rate that means a diver at 30 meters, well within recreational scuba diving range, already experiences 4 times the pressure present at the surface. By the time a vehicle reaches 1,000 meters, the pressure has increased to roughly 100 atmospheres. At the depth of the Challenger Deep, nearly 11,000 meters, the pressure exceeds 1,000 atmospheres, a figure that is not merely large, but categorically different from anything that biological tissue, however adapted, can withstand without the protection of a rigid pressure hull. There is no depth at which the human body, even with extensive physiological adaptation of the kind seen in elite free divers, can survive unprotected exposure to the pressures found in the deep trenches. The barrier is not one of training or willpower. It is a barrier built into the basic physics of how water behaves under its own weight, and no amount of human ingenuity changes the rate at which that weight accumulates. What ingenuity can do is build a structure capable of holding that weight at bay for the brief duration of a dive, and the entire history of deep submergence engineering is the history of trying to build that structure reliably enough, repeatedly enough, and safely enough that the deepest parts of the ocean become something more than a once-in-a-generation achievement reserved for a handful of expeditions. The decompression problem, distinct from the pressure containment problem that a rigid submersible hull solves, represents an entirely separate physical barrier that affects any human exposure to elevated pressure, even pressures far short of full ocean depth. When a diver breathes compressed air or other breathing gas at depth, the elevated pressure causes additional nitrogen and other gases to dissolve into the blood and tissues at concentrations proportional to the depth and duration of the exposure. If the diver ascends too quickly, this dissolved gas comes out of solution as bubbles within the body, a condition known as decompression sickness, which can cause symptoms ranging from joint pain to paralysis to death, depending on the severity and location of the bubble formation. This problem has nothing to do with the pressure hull of a vehicle and everything to do with the physiology of breathing compressed gas under pressure, which means it affects scuba divers and saturation divers working at depths that submersibles can traverse easily, but that present severe physiological hazards to anyone breathing gas at ambient pressure. Commercial saturation divers working on oil and gas infrastructure routinely operate at depths of 100 to 300 meters, living for weeks at a time in pressurized habitats to avoid the need for repeated decompression, surfacing only at the end of an assignment through a carefully controlled decompression process that can take days to complete safely. Even at these depths, far shallower than the trenches that submersibles like the limiting factor are built to reach, the physiological hazards of pressure exposure are severe enough that saturation diving is among the most carefully regulated and highest risk occupations in the world. The deep ocean does not merely resist vehicles. It resists the human body directly, at depths far shallower than the ones that capture the public imagination. And the engineering solutions that protect submersible occupants from ambient pressure exposure are precisely why those vehicles, rather than divers, are the only practical way to reach the deepest parts of the ocean at all. The Titan disaster has had consequences for deep ocean exploration that extend beyond the immediate tragedy. Commercial deep-sea tourism, the practice of selling seats on submersible dives to historic wrecks and other deep ocean sites to paying passengers without the certification standards applied to scientific and naval deep submergence vehicles, has come under intense regulatory and public scrutiny in the aftermath. The broader effect on funding and public appetite for deep ocean exploration, both crewed and uncrewed, has been difficult to measure precisely, but the increased caution and increased certification burden that has followed the disaster has, if anything, made it more difficult and more expensive to develop and operate deep submergence vehicles, reinforcing rather than reducing the barriers that have kept the deep ocean inaccessible. The deepest parts of the ocean remain, after the Titan disaster, exactly as physically inaccessible as they were before, and the renewed caution that the disaster has produced, while justified by the engineering failures it exposed, has not made the fundamental problem of reaching extreme depth any easier to solve. The wall that pressure builds around the deep ocean has not moved. If anything, the path toward it has become more carefully guarded, and the question of what that means for how much of the ocean floor humanity will ever actually see is one that the engineering community is still working through. What all of this engineering history and physical constraint adds up to is a simple and somewhat uncomfortable conclusion. Reaching the bottom of the ocean has never been, and is not currently, a problem that money alone solves quickly. It is a problem that requires years of specialized engineering, exhaustive testing, rare materials, and a tolerance for risk that very few organizations or individuals are willing or able to sustain. The handful of vehicles that have ever successfully reached full ocean depth represent decades of cumulative effort spread across more than 60 years, and the total number of human beings who have ever seen the bottom of the Challenger Deep with their own eyes remains, even now, smaller than the number of people who have walked on the surface of the moon. This is the first wall standing between humanity and a complete picture of the deep ocean floor, and it is the wall that every other limitation on exploration, the cost, the danger, the rarity of working vehicles, ultimately traces back to. The pressure has not changed since the Trieste first descended in 1960. What has changed is how clearly the scale of the engineering problem has come into focus, and how expensive and how rare the solutions to that problem have remained, even after 6 decades of trying. But pressure is only the first wall. There is a second one standing right behind it, and in some ways, it has proven even harder to break through. If pressure is the physical wall that keeps the deep ocean out of reach, money is the second wall, and in many respects, it is the more decisive one, because it determines whether the engineering effort required to overcome the first wall ever gets funded in the first place. The comparison between the cost of deep ocean exploration and the cost of space exploration is one that sounds counterintuitive until the actual numbers are examined. And then it becomes one of the more telling facts about where humanity has chosen to direct its exploratory ambition over the past 60 years. A single crewed mission to full ocean depth, using a vehicle like the limiting factor, requires a support ship, a trained crew, specialized launch and recovery systems, and the submersible itself, all of which must be maintained to certification standards that account for the catastrophic consequences of any failure. The total program cost for developing a single full ocean depth capable submersible, from initial design through certification and operational testing, has historically run into the tens of millions of dollars, and that figure does not include the ongoing costs of operating and maintaining the vehicle and its support infrastructure once it is operational. These are not small numbers, but they are also not the kind of numbers that should make deep ocean exploration impossible. What they reveal instead is a pattern of where this kind of money has actually been directed. The budget of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration for a single fiscal year typically exceeds $20 billion. The budget of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the primary United States agency responsible for ocean research, including deep-sea exploration, is a fraction of that figure, and within that already smaller budget, deep ocean exploration represents a small subset of the agency's total responsibilities, which also include weather forecasting, fisheries management, and coastal zone management. The disparity is not unique to the United States. Globally, the resources directed toward space exploration by government agencies, by private companies, and by international partnerships dwarf the resources directed toward deep ocean exploration by a wide margin. This is not because deep ocean exploration is inherently more expensive than space exploration. By most direct comparisons, the engineering challenges of reaching extreme ocean depth, while severe, are arguably less costly to solve than the engineering challenges of reaching orbit, traveling to the moon, or operating spacecraft beyond Earth's atmosphere. The difference in funding reflects a difference in priority, a societal and institutional choice about where exploratory ambition and the resources to pursue it should be directed, and that choice has consistently favored looking outward into space over looking downward into the ocean. The reasons for this disparity in priority are not purely practical, and understanding them requires looking at the cultural and political history of both space and ocean exploration in the 20th century. The space race of the 1950s and 60s was driven by a specific geopolitical competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, a competition that provided a level of sustained political will and public enthusiasm for the funding of space programs that ocean exploration never had a comparable driver for. Reaching orbit, reaching the moon, these were achievements with clear symbolic and propaganda value in the context of the Cold War, achievements that could be broadcast to a global audience and that demonstrated national technological capability in a way that was immediately legible to the public. Reaching the bottom of the Mariana Trench, while a genuine engineering achievement, never carried the same geopolitical weight, never captured the same level of sustained public attention, and never generated the same scale of political will to fund follow-on programs. The Trieste 1960 dive to the Challenger Deep happened in the same decade as the early space race, but it did not trigger a comparable wave of sustained investment in deep ocean exploration capability. The achievement was celebrated and then, in terms of follow-on funding, largely allowed to lapse, a pattern that contrasts sharply with the sustained, decades-long investment that a space exploration received even after the original Cold War competition that justified it had ended. The economics of deep ocean exploration are also shaped by the absence of the kind of clear, immediate commercial return that has driven private investment in other extreme environments. Deep-sea oil and gas extraction has generated enormous private investment in deep ocean engineering, but that investment has been narrowly focused on the specific technologies required to extract hydrocarbons from the seafloor, primarily at depths of a few thousand meters on continental shelves and slopes, rather than on the broader scientific exploration of the deep ocean floor across the full range of depths and locations where it exists. The technology developed for deep-sea oil and gas extraction, including remotely operated vehicles and subsea engineering capabilities, has incidentally advanced some of the tools available for deep ocean science, but the primary driver of that investment has been resource extraction rather than exploration, and the geographic and depth range of the investment has been narrowly tailored to where commercially viable oil and gas deposits are located, rather than distributed across the full range of the ocean floor that science might want to investigate. Deep-sea mining, the extraction of mineral resources, including polymetallic nodules, and seafloor massive sulfide deposits from depths of several thousand meters, represents another potential commercial driver for deep ocean technology investment. But this industry remains in an early and contested stage of development, facing significant regulatory uncertainty and environmental opposition that has slowed the pace of investment and limited its contribution to broader deep ocean exploration capability. The role of private philanthropy and individual wealth in funding deep ocean exploration has become increasingly significant as government funding has remained constrained, and the career of Viktor Veskovo, the businessman and explorer who founded and piloted the limiting factor to the deepest point of all 5 oceans, illustrates both the potential and the limitations of this funding model. Veskovo's expeditions were funded primarily through his personal wealth, accumulated through a career in private equity, and the program represented one of the largest privately funded deep ocean exploration efforts in history. The achievement was genuine and significant, demonstrating that repeatable full ocean depth diving was technically achievable. But the model of relying on individual wealthy patrons to fund deep ocean exploration is inherently fragile and unpredictable, dependent on the interests and resources of specific individuals rather than on sustained institutional commitment. When James Cameron funded and piloted the Deep Sea Challenger in 2012, it was likewise an individually funded effort rather than part of a sustained government or institutional program, and the vehicle was retired after its historic dive, rather than becoming the foundation for an ongoing exploration capability. This pattern, in which individual wealthy explorers periodically fund singular achievements that do not translate into sustained exploration infrastructure, has characterized much of the recent history of full ocean depth diving, and it stands in contrast to the sustained, decades-long institutional investment that has characterized space exploration even in periods when public enthusiasm for space programs has waned. The Titan disaster of June 2023 has had a chilling effect on this already fragile funding ecosystem that extends well beyond regulatory scrutiny and certification standards. Private investment in deep ocean exploration and tourism, which had been growing in the years before the disaster, as a small number of companies began offering paid expeditions to historic wrecks and other deep ocean sites, faced an immediate and severe contraction in investor and public confidence following the loss. The specific company involved in the disaster ceased operations entirely, but the broader effect on the perceived viability of commercial deep ocean tourism as an investment category has been significant, with potential investors and insurers becoming considerably more cautious about funding similar ventures. This matters for the broader question of deep ocean exploration funding because commercial deep-sea tourism, despite its association in the public mind primarily with wealthy individuals seeking adventure experiences, had represented one of the few growing sources of private capital flowing into deep submergence vehicle development and operation. A contraction in that source of funding, even if it affects primarily the tourism segment of deep ocean exploration rather than scientific research directly, reduces the overall pool of capital and expertise available for deep submergence vehicle operation, potentially slowing the development of the next generation of vehicles that scientific exploration programs might eventually be able to use or learn from. The scientific institutions that do fund deep ocean exploration, including the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, and various national oceanographic agencies, operate with budgets that are stable but modest relative to the scale of the exploration challenge they face. These institutions have made genuine and significant contributions to deep ocean science, developing remotely operated and autonomous vehicles that have conducted thousands of dives and produced enormous amounts of scientific data about the deep ocean environment, its biology, and its geology. But the scale of their operations, constrained by available funding, means that the rate at which new areas of deep ocean floor are explored and characterized remains slow relative to the total area requiring investigation. A single research cruise to conduct detailed seafloor mapping and biological sampling in a previously unexplored area can cost hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars when ship time, equipment, and personnel costs are accounted for, and the total area of unexplored ocean floor that would benefit from this kind of detailed investigation is measured in the tens of millions of square kilometers. At the current pace and funding level of deep ocean research globally, the complete, detailed exploration of the ocean floor at a resolution comparable to what has been achieved for the surface of Mars or the Moon would take many decades, possibly centuries, to complete, even without considering the additional constraints imposed by the physical difficulty of reaching the deepest portions of that floor. What emerges from examining the economics of deep ocean exploration is a picture of a problem that is not fundamentally about whether the engineering challenges can be solved. They can be, and they have been solved repeatedly in specific instances by specific, well-funded efforts. The problem is about sustained investment, about the absence of a funding model, whether governmental, commercial, or philanthropic, that has proven capable of maintaining continuous, large-scale deep ocean exploration capability over time in the way that space exploration funding has been maintained, with all its fluctuations, for more than 6 decades. Every successful full ocean depth dive in history has been, in financial terms, closer to a one-time event than the establishment of an ongoing program, and the gap between achievements, the 52 years between the Trieste and the next crewed Challenger deep dive, the singular nature of the Deep-Sea Challenger's mission, reflects this pattern of episodic rather than sustained investment. The question of what it would take to change this pattern, to fund deep ocean exploration at a scale and consistency comparable to space exploration, is not primarily a question of engineering feasibility. It is a question of priority, and the answer to that question, based on 6 decades of evidence, has consistently favored looking up rather than looking down. The autonomous and remotely operated vehicle sector has grown considerably faster than the crewed deep submergence sector over the past 2 decades, for a reason that is almost brutally simple. A remotely operated vehicle that suffers a catastrophic failure at depth results in the loss of expensive equipment, a serious but recoverable setback. A crewed submersible that suffers the same failure results in loss of life, the kind of irreversible outcome that the Titan disaster made impossible to ignore. That single difference in consequence drives an enormous difference in cost, certification burden, and risk tolerance, which is why the majority of recent investment in deep ocean technology has flowed toward uncrewed systems that can be built more cheaply, deployed more frequently, and risked more freely. Deep ocean exploration has, as a result, increasingly become something humans do remotely, through cameras and sensors and robotic manipulators, rather than something humans do by physically being present at depth. Layer onto this the insurance and liability costs that any organization operating a crewed vehicle must carry, premiums that have only climbed since the Titan disaster reminded every underwriter in the industry exactly what they are insuring against, and the picture becomes clear. The wall of pressure can be engineered around, given enough resources and enough time. The wall of money has proven, across 6 decades of evidence, to be considerably more durable. There is a way to make this disparity concrete that goes beyond comparing agency budgets. The total cost of the Apollo program, the effort that put 12 human beings on the surface of the moon between 1969 and 1972, has been estimated at well over $150 billion in current value. No deep ocean exploration program in the entire history of the field has ever come close to that scale of investment. Not the Trieste, not the Deep-Sea Challenger, not the limiting factor, not all of them combined. 12 men walked on a surface 250,000 miles away, in an environment with no air, no pressure, no liquid water, where nothing had ever lived and nothing ever would. Far fewer people have stood on the floor of the deepest trench in our own ocean, an environment that is, by comparison, teeming with undiscovered life. Sitting a few miles beneath ships that cross it every single day, the money went to the place that had nothing waiting in it. The place that has everything waiting in it got what was left over. What this economic reality means in practice, for the question of how much of the ocean floor humanity will actually come to know in detail, is sobering when stated plainly. At current funding levels, current technology, and current institutional priorities, the complete, detailed mapping and exploration of the deep ocean floor is not a project with a defined completion date on any realistic horizon. It is an ongoing, chronically underfunded effort that adds incremental coverage year by year, constrained not by what is technically possible, but by what gets prioritized for funding in competition with every other claim on scientific and exploratory budgets. The areas that do get explored tend to be those with the clearest, immediate justification: sites of known shipwrecks, regions with commercial resource potential, areas adjacent to existing research infrastructure, rather than a systematic, comprehensive survey of the ocean floor conducted for its own sake. This selective, opportunistic pattern of exploration has consequences for what remains unknown, because it means the gaps in coverage are not random. They are concentrated in exactly the regions that offer the least obvious, near-term justification for investment, which are often the most remote, the least accessible, and, almost by definition, the least understood parts of the ocean floor. What that means for what might actually be down there, in the parts of the map that remain blank, not because anyone decided they were unimportant, but because nobody has yet had a reason compelling enough to fund a look, is the question that drives everything that follows. We have a more detailed map of the surface of Mars than we have of the floor of our own ocean. This is not a figure of speech or an exaggeration for dramatic effect. It is a direct and verifiable comparison of mapping resolution, and it is one of the more uncomfortable facts about how humanity has chosen to allocate its exploratory attention. The surface of Mars has been mapped by orbital cameras to a resolution of approximately 5 meters across nearly the entire planet, with significant portions mapped at resolutions finer than 1 meter by missions like the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter. The floor of Earth's ocean, by contrast, has historically been mapped at a global resolution that, until very recently, was closer to 5 kilometers in most areas, meaning that features smaller than a large mountain range could be entirely invisible in the standard global bathymetric datasets that scientists and navigators have relied on for decades. The gap between these two figures, 5 meters for a planet tens of millions of kilometers away, and 5 kilometers for the floor of the ocean that covers most of our own planet, is not a small discrepancy. It is a difference of roughly 3 orders of magnitude in mapping resolution, and it reflects the fact that an orbital camera looking down through clear vacuum at a solid planetary surface has an inherently easier observational problem than a ship or satellite trying to characterize a seafloor obscured by kilometers of opaque, light-absorbing seawater. The reason orbital photography, the technique that has mapped Mars, the Moon, and every other solid surface in the solar system that spacecraft have visited, cannot be used to map the ocean. Floor comes down to a basic physical property of water that has no equivalent in the vacuum of space. Visible light penetrates seawater poorly, attenuating rapidly with depth due to absorption and scattering. And even in the clearest open ocean water, meaningful light penetration for imaging purposes extends to depths of perhaps 200 meters under ideal conditions, a tiny fraction of the average ocean depth of approximately 3,700 meters. Below this depth, the ocean is in permanent darkness, and no satellite or aircraft, however sophisticated its camera, can photograph what lies on the seafloor through kilometers of light-absorbing water. This means that the primary tool used to map every other solid surface humans have explored, direct optical imaging from orbit, is simply unavailable for mapping the vast majority of Earth's own ocean floor. Scientists have had to develop entirely different remote sensing techniques to characterize the seafloor, techniques that are fundamentally less precise, more time-consuming, and more expensive to deploy than pointing a camera at a planet from orbit. The primary technique used for ocean floor mapping is sonar, specifically multi-beam sonar systems mounted on the hulls of research and survey vessels, which emit pulses of sound that travel through the water column, reflect off the seafloor, and return to the ship, where the time delay and intensity of the returning signal are used to calculate the depth and character of the seafloor at that point. This technique works, and it has produced genuinely valuable data about the ocean floor over the decades it has been in use. But it suffers from a fundamental limitation that orbital photography does not share. A satellite can photograph an entire continent in a single pass, capturing millions of square kilometers of surface detail in minutes. A ship equipped with multi-beam sonar can only map a swath of seafloor roughly proportional to the water depth beneath it, typically a corridor a few kilometers wide, directly beneath and to either side of the vessel's track. To map the ocean floor in detail using shipboard sonar, a vessel must physically travel back and forth across the area in a systematic survey pattern, a process that, for any substantial area of seafloor, takes days, weeks, or months of dedicated ship time, at a cost that runs into the hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars for a single survey campaign covering a relatively modest area. Satellite altimetry has provided one partial solution to this coverage problem, using a completely different physical principle than direct sonar mapping. Satellites equipped with precise radar altimeters can measure extremely small variations in the height of the ocean surface, variations on the order of centimeters, that are caused by the gravitational pull of seafloor features like seamounts and trenches on the water above them. A large seamount rising from the ocean floor exerts a slightly stronger gravitational pull than the surrounding seafloor, which causes a very slight, measurable bulge in the ocean surface directly above it. By measuring these subtle surface height variations across the entire ocean from orbit, satellites can infer the approximate location and rough size of major seafloor features without ever directly imaging the seafloor itself. This technique has been enormously valuable for producing global bathymetric maps at the kind of coverage that ship-based sonar alone could never achieve in any reasonable time frame, and satellite-derived gravity maps have revealed the existence of tens of thousands of previously uncharted seamounts across the global ocean. But satellite altimetry has a critical limitation that distinguishes it sharply from direct optical imaging of a planetary surface. It can detect that something large is down there, inferring the rough size and location of a major feature from its gravitational signature, but it cannot resolve fine detail, cannot distinguish between a single large feature and several smaller adjacent ones, and cannot characterize what a feature actually looks like what it is made of, or whether it might be something other than a simple geological formation. The resolution achievable by satellite altimetry for seafloor features is typically on the order of several kilometers at best. A satellite gravity map can tell you a mountain is down there. It cannot tell you what it looks like, what it is made of, or what might be living on it. The Nippon Foundation and GEPCO Seabed 2030 project is the most ambitious global ocean floor mapping initiative ever attempted, and it illustrates both how far this work has come and how far it still has to go. Launched in 2016 with the goal of mapping the entire ocean floor at 100-meter resolution by the year 2030, the project has made real progress, more than quadrupling its global coverage in less than a decade by stitching together survey data from research vessels, commercial shipping, and even submarine cable companies. But even if the project hits its target exactly on schedule, the resulting map will still be roughly 20 times coarser than the maps that already exist for the surface of Mars. A planet tens of millions of kilometers away that no human being has ever set foot on will remain better mapped than the floor of our own ocean. That is the gap this entire project is racing to close, and even success will not fully close it. The practical consequences of this mapping gap become apparent when specific examples are examined. The Mariana Trench itself, despite being the most famous and most studied deep ocean feature on the planet, was not mapped in its full detail until relatively recently, and significant portions of the broader trench system surrounding the Challenger Deep remain incompletely surveyed at high resolution even today. Entire seamount chains, underwater mountain ranges that, in some cases, rival the scale of major terrestrial mountain ranges, have been discovered essentially by accident, identified first through the kind of low-resolution satellite gravity signature described earlier, and only later confirmed and characterized in detail by dedicated sonar survey expeditions that happen to pass through the area for other purposes. The Pacific Ocean alone is estimated to contain tens of thousands of seamounts that have never been individually surveyed at high resolution, structures that in many cases rise thousands of meters from the surrounding seafloor, structures of a scale that, if they existed on land, would be immediately visible, climbed, named, and studied, but that remain in the ocean, essentially invisible because nobody has had the ship time, the funding, or the specific reason to go look closely. The biological implications of this mapping gap compound the geological ones in ways that connect directly to the broader pattern of undiscovered deep ocean life. A seamount that has never been surveyed at high resolution has also, by definition, never been biologically sampled in any systematic way, because biological sampling typically follows geological characterization, with researchers identifying interesting seafloor features through mapping and then deploying remotely operated vehicles or sampling equipment to investigate the biological communities associated with those features. Seamounts in particular have proven to be unusually rich biological habitats, creating localized upwelling currents that concentrate nutrients and support dense communities of corals, sponges, fish, and other organisms that can differ significantly from the biological communities found on the surrounding flat abyssal plain. Every unsurveyed seamount represents not just a gap in the geological map, but a potential gap in the biological catalog of the ocean, an ecosystem that has never been examined by any scientist, that may contain species found nowhere else, and that exists in a location that, until satellite altimetry or incidental sonar coverage happens to reveal it, nobody even knows is there to investigate. The honest accounting of how much of the ocean floor has actually been explored, as opposed to merely mapped at a coarse resolution sufficient to know that something is there, is considerably more sobering than even the resolution statistics suggest. Mapping a seafloor feature at 100-meter resolution tells you its approximate shape and size. It does not tell you what it is made of, what lives on it, whether it shows signs of unusual geological activity, or whether it contains anything that would be considered scientifically remarkable if examined up close. The kind of detailed visual and biological investigation that has been conducted for the surface of Mars, where rovers have directly examined rock samples, analyzed soil chemistry, and searched for signs of past water activity across multiple specific sites chosen for their scientific interest, has been conducted for only an infinitesimally small fraction of the ocean floor, limited to the specific locations that remotely operated vehicles and submersibles have actually visited. A number of sites that, across the entire history of deep ocean exploration, can be counted in the thousands rather than distributed systematically across the millions of square kilometers of seafloor that exist below depths inaccessible to casual investigation. The ocean floor is not merely undermapped. It is, in the specific sense of detailed scientific investigation, that distinguishes genuine exploration from rough cartography, almost entirely unexplored, and the gap between what we have charted and what we have actually examined closely is the space in which the genuinely unknown still lives. The anomalies that do turn up in the limited data that exists, the sonar readings, the satellite gravity measurements, and the occasional incidental survey passes, are themselves a category worth examining, because they illustrate what kind of discoveries are still possible even within the constraints of current mapping technology. Sonar surveys conducted for purposes other than dedicated seafloor science, including naval surveys, submarine cable route planning, and oil and gas exploration, have on multiple occasions returned readings that did not match any known or expected seafloor feature, readings that required follow-up investigation to determine whether they represented genuine geological formations, previously undocumented shipwrecks, or simply artifacts of the sonar equipment and the complex acoustic environment of the ocean. The vast majority of these anomalies, when investigated, turn out to have mundane explanations, geological formations that simply had not been previously documented in that specific location, or sonar returns distorted by temperature and salinity variations in the water column that can bend and scatter acoustic signals in ways that produce misleading readings. But the investigation itself requires resources, ship time, and often a specific reason to prioritize that particular anomaly over the countless others that the limited surveying capacity of the global research fleet might otherwise be directed toward, which means that many sonar anomalies are recorded, noted, and then never followed up on, sitting in survey databases as unresolved data points that nobody has had the funding or the specific motivation to investigate further, The accumulated archive of unresolved sonar anomalies across decades of naval, commercial, and scientific survey work represents a kind of passive catalog of potential discoveries, a list of places where something unexpected was detected but never confirmed. And the size of that list grows every year as more surveys are conducted, even as the rate at which anomalies are actually followed up and resolved remains constrained by the same funding and ship time limitations that constrain dedicated mapping efforts more broadly. The submarine telecommunications cable industry has become an unexpected but increasingly important source of incidental ocean floor data, illustrating how the limited mapping coverage that does exist is often a byproduct of commercial activity rather than the result of dedicated scientific surveying. The global network of fiber optic cables that carries the overwhelming majority of international internet traffic runs along the ocean floor across every major ocean basin, and the companies that plan, lay, and maintain this infrastructure conduct detailed seafloor surveys along proposed cable routes to identify hazards, avoid unstable geological features like underwater landslide zones, and select paths that minimize the risk of damage from fishing activity, anchoring, or natural seafloor processes. These surveys, conducted purely for commercial and engineering purposes related to protecting expensive infrastructure, have incidentally produced some of the highest resolution seafloor mapping data available for the specific corridors they cover, data that in many cases has subsequently been shared with or acquired by scientific institutions and incorporated into broader bathymetric datasets like those compiled by the Seabed 2030 project. But this data, valuable as it is, covers only the narrow corridors along which cables happen to be routed, generally selected for the shortest and most stable path between 2 points on land, rather than for any scientific interest in the seafloor terrain itself, which means that even this relatively rich source of incidental high-resolution data leaves the vast majority of the ocean floor, the areas that no cable route happens to cross, just as unmapped and unexamined as it was before. The pattern repeats across every source of incidental data that contributes to ocean floor knowledge. Coverage follows commercial and military necessity, not scientific curiosity, and the result is a patchwork of detailed knowledge scattered unevenly across a floor that remains, in its overwhelming majority, genuinely unknown. What all of this means, when the mapping statistics, the sonar limitations, the unresolved anomalies, and the patchwork pattern of incidental coverage are considered together, is that the ocean floor occupies a strange epistemic position relative to every other large surface on this planet or in the accessible solar system. It is not unknown in the way that something theoretical or unobservable is unknown. It is physically present, sitting beneath water that covers most of the planet humans actually live on, accessible in principle to the same kinds of survey technology that has mapped Mars in exquisite detail. And yet it remains, after more than a century of organized oceanographic science, less thoroughly examined than the surface of a planet tens of millions of kilometers away that no human being has ever set foot on. The blank spaces on the ocean floor map are not blank because nothing is there. They are blank because nobody has yet had the time, the money, or the reason to look closely enough to find out what is. Every time a remotely operated vehicle descends into a previously unsampled region of the deep ocean, even a region that has already been mapped at reasonable resolution, there is a meaningful statistical likelihood that it will encounter something that has never been formally documented by science. This is not speculation or sensationalism. It is a pattern that has held consistently across decades of deep-sea expeditions conducted by institutions like the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and the Schmidt Ocean Institute, organizations that have made the unglamorous but scientifically critical work of systematic deep-sea biological surveying their primary mission. The rate of new species discovery on deep-sea expeditions has not declined as exploration has continued. If anything, it has increased as remotely operated vehicle technology has improved, as camera resolution has gotten sharper, as sampling equipment has become more capable of collecting delicate organisms without destroying them in the process. This persistent, undiminished rate of discovery is itself a piece of evidence about the scale of what remains uncatalogued, because in a well-explored environment, the rate of new species discovery should decline over time as the existing biodiversity becomes progressively better documented. In the deep ocean, that decline has not happened, which strongly suggests that the total inventory of undiscovered deep-sea life remains far larger than the cumulative discoveries made so far. The census of marine life, the most comprehensive attempt ever made to systematically inventory ocean biodiversity, conducted between 2000 and the end of the decade with the participation of more than 2,700 scientists from over 80 countries, produced an estimate that has become one of the foundational figures in discussions of ocean biodiversity. The total number of marine species, including those formally described and those estimated to exist but not yet documented, was projected to fall somewhere between 700,000 and 1 million, with the existing formally described total at the time representing only a fraction of that estimated range. The authors of the census were explicit about the limitations of their own sampling effort, noting that the deep ocean, despite representing the largest habitable volume on the planet by a substantial margin, remained the least sampled environment included in their survey, with entire categories of deep-sea habitat, including haddo trenches, abyssal plains far from any coastline, and the water column at intermediate depths, receiving only a tiny fraction of the sampling effort directed at more accessible coastal and shallow water environments. The conclusion that somewhere between half and 3/4 of all marine species remain formally undescribed was not treated by the marine biology community as a surprising or controversial finding. It was treated as a confirmation of what the pattern of ongoing discovery had already been suggesting, that the cataloging of ocean life remains, even after more than a century of organized marine biology, in its early stages relative to the actual scale of what exists. The specific categories of undiscovered or poorly understood deep-sea organisms span the full range of biological complexity, from single-celled organisms to large vertebrates, and the diversity of what remains uncharacterized resists any simple summary. At the microscopic scale, the deep ocean hosts vast communities of bacteria and archaea whose metabolic diversity exceeds anything found in surface environments, organisms that have evolved to extract energy from chemical reactions involving methane, sulfur compounds, and other substances that would be toxic or simply unusable as energy sources for surface life. The genetic diversity within these microbial communities has been characterized as exceeding the genetic diversity of all visible animal life combined, a claim that sounds extraordinary until the scale of microbial diversity in any environment, surface, or deep sea, is properly appreciated, and that becomes genuinely staggering when applied to an environment as vast and as variable in its specific chemical and physical conditions as the deep ocean floor. At the other end of the size scale, large deep-sea organisms, including various species of squid, fish, and other vertebrates, continue to be documented for the first time on a regular basis, with several previously unknown species of anglerfish, snailfish, and other deep-sea fish described in scientific literature in just the past several years, organisms large enough to be immediately visually striking when first captured on camera, but that had simply never been observed by any human being or scientific instrument prior to their discovery. The Hadal Zone, the deepest portion of the ocean found in the trench systems below approximately 6,000 meters, represents a particularly underexplored category within an already underexplored environment, and the biological discoveries made in Hadal trenches over the past 2 decades illustrate how much remains to be found even within the small fraction of deep ocean habitat that has received any dedicated scientific attention. The Hadal snailfish, a family of fish adapted to survive at pressures that would be lethal to virtually any other vertebrate, was essentially unknown to science in any detail until specialized deep-sea landers, autonomous instruments designed to descend to extreme depth, capture footage, and return to the surface without requiring a tethered connection to a support vessel, began conducting systematic surveys of Hadal trenches in the 2010s. These surveys revealed not just new species, but an entire previously unsuspected ecological community thriving at depths that had been assumed, based on the extreme physical conditions, to be largely barren of complex life. The biochemical adaptations that allow these fish to survive at pressures exceeding 800 atmospheres, including specialized stabilizing compounds in their cellular proteins that prevent the pressure-induced structural breakdown that would destroy the proteins of any surface-adapted organism, were entirely unknown before these Hadal expeditions began, representing a category of biology that simply did not exist in the scientific literature until very recently, and that almost certainly contains further unexplored complexity in the trenches and at the depths that even these pioneering Hadal surveys have not yet reached. The technological limitations that constrain what can actually be observed and documented during a deep-sea expedition, even when a capable vehicle successfully reaches a previously unexplored area, deserve particular attention, because they explain why the rate of discovery, even in areas that have technically been visited by a research vehicle, remains far from a complete characterization of what exists there. A remotely operated vehicle, equipped with cameras and lights, illuminates only a relatively small volume of water and seafloor directly in front of it at any given moment, meaning that even a successful dive to a previously unvisited location captures only a narrow transect through that location's actual biodiversity, analogous to walking through an unexplored forest at night with a flashlight and assuming that the narrow cone of illuminated ground represents the complete inventory of everything living in that forest. Many deep-sea organisms, particularly smaller and more delicate species, actively avoid the lights and noise generated by approaching vehicles, retreating into sediment or fleeing the illuminated area before they can be observed or recorded, which means that even direct visual surveys likely undercount the true biodiversity present at any given site, capturing primarily the larger, less mobile, or less light-sensitive organisms, while missing an unknown fraction of smaller, more cryptic, or more behaviorally cautious species that remain present but undetected. There is a more unsettling problem hiding underneath all of this, one that has to do with what science has been able to catch rather than what it has been able to see. For more than a century, the primary tool for collecting deep-sea specimens was the trawl net, dragged along the seafloor and hauled back to the surface. A trawl net is good at capturing robust, slow-moving organisms. It is catastrophically bad at capturing anything soft: jellyfish, ctenophores, and the countless other gelatinous animals that drift through the deep ocean are often torn apart or simply dissolve under the mechanical stress of the net and the pressure change of the journey upward, arriving at the surface, if they arrive at all, as unrecognizable pulp. For 100 years, an entire category of life was being systematically erased from the scientific record before anyone ever got a clear look at it. Only in recent decades, with direct visual observation from submersibles and remotely operated vehicles that never touch the animals at all, has it become possible to see what the nets were missing. And some marine biologists now argue that gelatinous organisms may represent a far larger share of total deep-sea biomass than a century of trawl data ever suggested. If that turns out to be true, much of what science has assumed about how energy moves through the deep ocean food web was built on a catalog that was quietly, invisibly incomplete from the very beginning. The question of what kind of life might exist at the absolute extremes of depth and pressure that remain almost entirely beyond the reach of current exploration technology connects directly to ongoing research into the fundamental limits of biological function under extreme physical conditions. The deepest confirmed vertebrate ever recorded, a snailfish photographed at a depth exceeding 8,000 meters in the Izu Ogasawara Trench, appears to be approaching what researchers have identified as a theoretical biochemical limit for vertebrate life at depth, a limit set by the solubility of trimethylamine oxide, the specific stabilizing compound that prevents the pressure-induced breakdown of proteins in deep-sea fish, which become saturated within body tissues at pressures corresponding to roughly 8,000 to 8,500 meters of depth. This suggests that vertebrate fish, using the specific biochemical strategy that has been documented in known hadal species, may be approaching a hard biological wall at depths still well short of the 11,000 meters found in the deepest ocean trenches, raising the genuinely open scientific question of whether any vertebrate life exists at all in the deepest few thousand meters of the hadal zone, or whether that extreme depth range is occupied exclusively by invertebrates and microorganisms that have found alternative biochemical solutions to the pressure problem that do not share the specific limitation that appears to cap vertebrate depth tolerance. Answering this question definitively would require systematic biological sampling at depths that only a handful of vehicles in the entire world are currently capable of reaching. Whether any backboned animal has ever swum in the deepest few thousand meters of this planet's oceans is, right now, a genuine unknown, not a mystery science has chosen not to solve. A mystery nobody has yet had the means to even properly ask. The structures that have been documented on the deep ocean floor that are not biological in origin add another layer to the question of what remains to be characterized in detail, and several of these features illustrate how the same combination of pressure barriers and funding limitations that constrain biological exploration also constrains the detailed investigation of geological and chemical phenomena that have been detected but not fully examined. The brine pools discovered at various locations on the deep ocean floor, dense pockets of extremely salty water that have separated from the surrounding seawater due to localized geological processes and that sit in depressions on the seafloor with a sharp, visible boundary against the less saline water above them, represent an environment so chemically extreme that it has been informally described by researchers as an underwater lake, complete with its own distinct shoreline and surface visible on camera footage, despite being located thousands of meters beneath the actual ocean surface. These brine pools have been found to host highly specialized microbial communities adapted to salt concentrations that would be lethal to virtually any other organism. And the full extent of these brine pool ecosystems, including how many such pools exist across the global ocean floor, and what specific adaptations allow life to persist within them, remains incompletely documented because each known brine pool requires a dedicated, remotely operated vehicle expedition to investigate in detail, and the total number of such expeditions conducted to date remains small relative to the likely number of undiscovered brine pools that satellite and sonar data suggest may exist in similar geological settings across multiple ocean basins that have not yet been surveyed at the resolution required to identify them. The methane seeps and associated chemosynthetic communities that have been documented along continental margins worldwide represent another category of deep-sea phenomenon where the pace of new discovery has consistently outpaced the rate at which existing discoveries can be fully characterized. Each newly identified methane seep typically hosts its own distinct community of specialized organisms, including tube worms, clams, and mussels adapted to derive energy from the chemical reactions associated with methane and hydrogen sulfide emerging from the seafloor, and researchers conducting systematic surveys along continental margins continue to identify new seep sites on a regular basis, sites that in many cases host species assemblages distinct enough from previously documented seeps to suggest genuine biological novelty rather than simply additional examples of already cataloged seep communities. The total extent of methane seep activity along the world's continental margins remains incompletely mapped, and the cumulative biological and geochemical significance of this widespread but individually small-scale phenomenon, multiplied across however many seeps actually exist globally, represents a category of deep ocean activity whose full-scale and ecological importance is still being actively assessed by the relatively small number of research groups with the funding and equipment to conduct this kind of specialized investigation. What connects all of these categories of incomplete knowledge, the undiscovered species, the unexplored hadal depths, the uncharacterized brine pools and methane seeps, is the same underlying pattern of pressure, cost, and a scale that makes the deep ocean so resistant to thorough investigation. The technology to investigate these phenomena in detail exists. The expeditions that have been conducted have consistently demonstrated that wherever scientists have managed to point a capable instrument, something previously undocumented has been found. The limiting factor has never been a lack of things to discover. It has been the combination of pressure, cost, and the sheer scale of the ocean floor that determines how much of that discoverable territory anyone actually gets to examine in any given year. Every expedition that does get funded returns with findings that confirm the pattern. New species, new geological features, new chemical environments, and every expedition that does not get funded leaves an unknown quantity of equally significant findings sitting undiscovered in whatever location nobody happened to have the resources to visit. The deep ocean is not a frontier that is gradually being closed as exploration proceeds. It is a frontier whose edges keep receding at roughly the same pace that exploration advances into it, because the rate of discovery has shown no sign of declining, even as the cumulative scientific effort invested in deep ocean biology has grown. What this means for the specific question of what is actually down there in the overwhelming majority of ocean floor that remains entirely unvisited by any vehicle, any camera, any sampling equipment, is a question that the data available so far can only partially answer, and the honest scientific position is that the full answer remains, and will likely remain for a very long time, genuinely unknown. There is a particular kind of irony in the fact that humanity has built telescopes capable of photographing galaxies billions of light years away, has landed robotic vehicles on the surface of Mars and driven them across its terrain for years, has sent spacecraft past the orbit of Pluto and out into interstellar space, while the deepest trench in our own ocean, less than 11 kilometers beneath ships that cross it every day, has been visited by human beings only a handful of times in the history of our species. We have chosen, consistently and repeatedly, across 6 decades of exploratory ambition and exploratory funding, to look outward before we finished looking down. This is not a condemnation. The achievements of space exploration are genuine and extraordinary, and the scientific knowledge gained from them has expanded human understanding in ways that have value independent of any comparison to ocean exploration. But the choice has consequences, and one of those consequences is that the largest unexplored territory accessible to our species is not somewhere else in the solar system. It is here, on this planet, underwater, that most people see every day without any sense that it conceals something closer to genuinely unknown than almost anywhere else humans could point an instrument. Consider what this means in concrete terms. A person standing on a beach anywhere in the world is, in a very real sense, standing closer to genuinely unexplored territory than an astronaut orbiting the Earth. The astronaut is looking down at a planet that has been comprehensively mapped, photographed from every angle, and studied in such detail that very little about its surface remains a mystery. The person on the beach is standing at the edge of an environment where, a few kilometers out and a few kilometers down, the floor has never been seen by any human eye, where species that have never been named are moving through the dark right now, where structures and chemical environments and entire ecosystems exist in a state of complete and total anonymity. The distance between the beach and that unexplored territory is not measured in light years or astronomical units. It is measured in a number of kilometers small enough that a determined swimmer could, in principle, cover it in a single day, if the swimmer could survive what waits at the bottom of that swim, which no unprotected human body can. The unexplored is not far away. It is close, closer than almost anything else humanity has chosen to call a frontier. And that proximity, paradoxically, seems to have made it easier to ignore rather than harder. The psychological dimension of why this choice has been made so consistently across different countries, different funding eras, and different generations of scientists and explorers is worth considering directly rather than only through the lens of cost and engineering difficulty. Space exploration offers a kind of clean, legible narrative of progress that deep ocean exploration has never quite managed to generate in the public imagination. A rocket launch is visible, photogenic, broadcast live, building toward a clear and dramatic moment of success or failure that audiences can watch unfold in real time. A deep ocean expedition, by contrast, happens invisibly, beneath the surface, monitored through screens of sonar data and remotely operated vehicle camera feeds that, however scientifically significant, rarely generate the same visceral sense of witnessing history that a rocket clearing its launch tower does. The darkness and pressure that make the deep ocean physically difficult to explore also make it difficult to dramatize, to package into the kind of narrative that sustains long-term public enthusiasm and the political will that follows from it. Space has always had better marketing, not because the people involved in ocean exploration have failed at communication, but because the basic physical nature of what they are doing, descending into invisible darkness rather than rising toward a visible sky, resists the kind of narrative arc that captures sustained attention. There is also a deeper, more uncomfortable possibility worth considering, which is that the choice to look outward rather than downward reflects something about what each direction represents to the human imagination. Space exploration extends humanity outward toward new territory, new possibility, the open-ended promise of frontiers that have never been touched by anything terrestrial at all. The deep ocean, despite being genuinely alien in its physical conditions, remains stubbornly part of this planet, part of the world we already inhabit. And there is perhaps less mythological appeal in discovering what has been hiding beneath our own feet than in reaching towards something that exists entirely beyond the world we already know. This is speculation rather than established fact, but it may explain why a civilization that found the will to send human beings to the moon has never found the same will to map the floor of its own ocean, even though the ocean floor is, by any honest measure, the larger and stranger unknown of the two. The specific knowledge that remains locked behind the barriers of pressure and funding has implications that extend well beyond simple scientific curiosity about what creatures might be swimming in the dark. The deep ocean plays a critical role in regulating Earth's climate, absorbing a substantial fraction of the excess heat and carbon dioxide generated by human industrial activity, and the detailed mechanisms by which this absorption occurs, how it varies across different ocean regions and depths, and how it might change as ocean temperatures continue to rise, remain incompletely understood, precisely because the deep ocean processes that drive this absorption are difficult to directly observe and measure at the scale and resolution that would be required for fully confident climate modeling. The biodiversity that remains uncatalogued in the deep ocean may contain organisms with biochemical properties of significant value to medicine, agriculture, and industrial biotechnology, a possibility that has already been validated by the discovery of unique enzymes and compounds in deep-sea organisms that have found applications in fields ranging from pharmaceutical development to industrial chemistry, applications that depend entirely on first discovering and characterizing the organisms in question, a process that the current pace of exploration extends across timescales measured in decades and centuries rather than years. The mineral resources distributed across the deep ocean floor, including polymetallic nodules and seafloor massive sulfide deposits, represent both an economic opportunity and an environmental risk whose full scope cannot be properly assessed without the kind of detailed seafloor characterization that remains for the vast majority of the ocean floor, simply unavailable. The question of whether the current pattern of underinvestment in deep ocean exploration is likely to change in the coming decades does not have a confident answer, but there are some specific developments worth noting as potential catalysts for change. The growing recognition of the deep ocean's role in climate regulation has begun to attract increased scientific funding directed specifically at understanding deep ocean carbon cycling and heat absorption, driven by the practical necessity of improving climate models rather than by exploratory curiosity for its own sake, but funding that nonetheless contributes incrementally to the broader project of characterizing the deep ocean environment in detail. The declining cost of autonomous underwater vehicle technology, driven by advances in battery technology, sensor miniaturization, and artificial intelligence systems capable of allowing vehicles to navigate and make decisions with reduced reliance on continuous human operator control, has begun to make sustained, distributed deep ocean monitoring more economically feasible than it was even a decade ago, potentially allowing a larger number of institutions with more modest budgets to contribute meaningfully to ocean floor exploration in ways that were previously accessible only to the largest, best-funded research programs. Whether these incremental developments will accumulate into the kind of sustained, large-scale investment that would meaningfully close the gap between what has been explored and what remains unknown, on anything resembling the timescale that has characterized space exploration, remains genuinely uncertain, and the honest assessment, based on 6 decades of historical pattern, is that the gap is more likely to close slowly, unevenly, and incompletely than to be resolved by any single dramatic shift in funding priority. What remains, in the meantime, is an ocean floor that covers the majority of this planet's surface, that exists in a state of genuine and largely unaddressed scientific uncertainty, and that continues, year after year, to demonstrate through the small fraction of expeditions that do get funded that it contains more than current science has managed to catalog. The species not yet discovered, the geological formations not yet mapped, the chemical environments not yet characterized, all exist right now in the dark, under pressure that no unprotected human body could survive, in locations that nobody has had the resources or the specific reason to visit. This is not a temporary condition that will resolve itself as technology continues to advance along its current trajectory. The technology to map and explore the ocean floor in detail comparable to what has been achieved for the surface of Mars already exists in principle. What has been missing is the sustained will to deploy that technology at the scale the task requires. And there is no clear evidence, based on the pattern of the past 60 years, that this will is likely to materialize on any predictable timeline. The deep ocean will remain, for the foreseeable future, the largest genuinely unexplored territory accessible to our species, sitting beneath the surface of a planet we have otherwise mapped, photographed, and cataloged in extraordinary detail, waiting in darkness for an investment of attention and resources that has, so far, consistently gone somewhere else. The scale of what this means becomes clearer when the comparison to space exploration is pushed one step further than the funding statistics alone can capture. Every astronaut who has traveled to orbit, to the moon, or beyond has done so as part of a mission with a clear destination, a planned trajectory, and a body of accumulated knowledge about the environment they would encounter, built up over decades of robotic precursor missions that mapped, photographed, and characterized the destination in detail before any human being was sent there. Nobody descends into the deep ocean with that same depth of prior characterization available to them, because the robotic precursor missions that would provide it, the detailed mapping, the systematic biological surveys, the comprehensive geological characterization, have simply not been conducted at anything approaching the scale or thoroughness that preceded human space exploration. Every deep ocean expedition, even now in the 2020s, retains an element of genuine first contact uncertainty that space missions largely eliminated decades ago through the sheer volume of preparatory robotic exploration that preceded any human journey. This is perhaps the clearest single illustration of how far behind deep ocean exploration remains. A trip to the moon is, by comparison, a known quantity. A trip to the bottom of our own ocean still is not. The choice to look up rather than down has shaped what we know about our own planet in ways that are easy to overlook because the gap is invisible from the surface. Anyone can look at the night sky and feel the presence of everything that has not yet been explored out there, the vast distances, the unanswered questions about other worlds. Almost nobody, standing at the edge of the ocean, feels the equivalent presence of everything that remains unexplored directly beneath the water in front of them, because the ocean's surface gives no visual indication of the darkness and the unknown that exists just a few kilometers down. The deep ocean does not announce its mysteries the way the night sky does. It keeps them quietly, under pressure, in darkness, indifferent to whether anyone ever comes looking. There is a final consideration worth raising, one that moves beyond the practical questions of funding and engineering into something closer to a question about what kind of relationship a species should have with its own planet. Humanity has, in the span of a single century, developed the capability to leave Earth entirely, to send instruments and eventually human beings beyond the boundary of the atmosphere and out into the surrounding solar system. This capability represents a genuine expansion of what our species is able to do, and the knowledge gained from it has reshaped fields ranging from astronomy to material science to medicine. But the same century that produced this outward expansion has left the deepest parts of our own planet almost as mysterious as they were when the Trieste first descended into the Challenger Deep in 1960. We have learned to leave home before we finish learning what home actually contains, and there is something worth sitting with in that fact. It suggests that the human impulse to explore has been shaped, perhaps inevitably, by what captures attention and generates narrative momentum rather than by any systematic assessment of where the genuinely unknown actually exists. The deep ocean has never needed to be discovered in the way a distant planet needs to be discovered, because it has always been here, underneath us, present and physical and real. And perhaps that simple fact has made it easier to overlook, easier to assume it will always be there waiting whenever we eventually get around to it. It is still waiting. It has been waiting for 60 years. Whether the wait continues for another 60 or whether the pattern finally breaks is a question that depends entirely on choices that have not yet been made, by people and institutions that have not yet decided that the dark water beneath their own feet deserves the same ambition that has already been spent reaching toward the stars. And somewhere down there, past the point where light penetrates, past the point where ships can chart a course by sonar alone, past the pressure that has crushed every vehicle careless enough to underestimate it, something is moving through the dark, in a place that no camera has ever pointed at, that no instrument has ever measured, that no human being has ever seen, and that, on the current pace of exploration, may never be seen by anyone for a very long time. Don't go down, the warning says, and in a literal sense, almost nobody does. The pressure forbids it. The cost forbids it. The map forbids it, because there is barely a map at all. What is left is the dark, undisturbed, exactly as it has been for longer than our species has existed to wonder about it, waiting for an attention that has so far always found somewhere else to look first. If this journey moved something in you, consider subscribing to Sleep on Deep. Every week, we descend a little further. The ocean is waiting.